which is certainly a very topical discussion today, and where it started very much in the Caribbean from the point of view of the regional catastrophic insurance facility. So SRPSRE is an institution, a regional specialized institution of CARICOM that really got started out of a broader project that took place in the 80s, looking at this whole business of comprehensive disaster risk management. So way back in the 80s, the Caribbean really looked at the challenges it faced with risk, and there was a project funded by a number of development partners in the Caribbean called the Pan-Caribbean Project for Disaster Preparedness and Prevention. Out of that project, it was felt that the success needed to be sustained within an organization that would carry on the regional public goods and services for disaster risk management, specifically recognizing the vulnerability of the Caribbean community, the inherent vulnerability of the Caribbean community, and the growing exposure as the Caribbean sought to invest and to grow as a region, but also recognizing the variability in capacities within the Caribbean, small states, even smaller states, and trying to address the issue of risk. So they created, at the time, a response-centric organization. So we were supposed to have been an organization looking at the broader, comprehensive issues of disaster risk, a la what Sendai and Hyogo promotes, but for expediency, they created an organization that was focused on responding, acting more like a federated institution, responding to the needs of individual member states. So SRPSRE was created in 1991 by the heads of government of the Caribbean. However, by 2009, just before the Haiti earthquake, and also with the joining of Haiti as a member of SRPSRE, we were renamed. Essentially, SRPSRE at the time, in 2001, piloted the first ever comprehensive blueprint for dealing with disaster risk. It's called the CDM strategy. And with that, the heads of government felt that we were now attaining the initial intent of the agency and thought that we needed to remove the R and put the M, focusing on the comprehensive approach. And so our mandate, as you will see, is still very response-centric, but there is a very important piece at the bottom which is looking at encouraging disaster loss reduction and establishing cooperative mechanisms. And also in the middle, where we talk about mitigating and eliminating the immediate consequences of disasters. All the rest of it really is focusing on relief coordination for member states. And I'll talk a little bit about how that happens a little later on. So this is the full list of member countries of SRPSRE. As you can see, it spans Bahamas in the northwest, all the way to Suriname on the South American continent. So essentially all of the small island developing states and low-lying coastal developing states are members of SRPSRE. We are currently in dialogue with the French territories and with the Dominican Republic, more within the context of a memorandum of understanding, since we face similar challenges and look to see how we can better cooperate, primarily in emergencies in particular. Let me step back just a bit. So the ones that are shaded in black are because these are the two non-English speaking territories, Haiti, French, and Suriname Dutch. What we've done with the region as well is to divide, and this is primarily for emergency response coordination, for effective emergency response coordination. We've divided the region into 4 sub-regions, headed by countries that is viewed to have particular advantage from a logistics point of view, from a capacity point of view. So they serve as the big brother or big sister for the other countries within that particular space. And so recently in September, we would have had to respond after Irma. Antigua was our staging area, given that several of the countries in that sub-region, and that includes Anguilla, St. Kitts, and the British Virgin Islands, were under threat from Hurricane Irma. In the central sub-region, you have Barbados, where most of the resources we deployed to Dominica was drawn from out of Barbados. Again, it allows us to move very quickly into the space if they're not impacted, and allows us to draw resources from this particular area. But as you would imagine, within the space of what may be a regional or a global response, everybody wants to play in the theater of operations. So we had member states out of the far west, Jamaica, and Trinidad in the far south, wanting to support the operations, and we facilitated that bilateral approach. So SRPSRE, in doing all of this, what SRPSRE does to advance its priorities in the member states is through a broader regional strategy called the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy. It's in its third iteration. It was first developed in 2001 and was one of the forerunner to the Hyogo Framework of Action. In fact, the Hyogo Framework of Action came out of the Kingston Declaration a year before Hyogo was launched, but was building upon the good practices outlined in the CDM strategy. It's a results-based strategy and programming framework, and it very much expresses the nexus between climate change, development, and disasters. And we see it as an integrated risk management strategy. This is, at a glance, the four priority areas, the four pillars, one which looks at institutional strengthening, one which looks at knowledge management, but not simply public awareness. We're talking about research and science and empirical information and how that is used to make effective decisions. Priority area 3, which looks at integration of comprehensive disaster management consideration into key sectors. So we're talking about social protection. This is one of the areas where we look at the social sector and look to see how we integrate those disaster risk management considerations into those key sectors of any country's development. And on the fourth pillar, we're talking about community resilience building. Let's see if there's a pointer on this. No? There's none. But there is one which looks at the whole issue of livelihood protection. So earlier on, there was a conversation about how we view this issue of social protection. Do we view it narrowly, or do we see the broader aspects of it? Looking at all the areas of vulnerability, the elderly, the disabled, which are oftentimes forgotten in any response, but also small-scale livelihoods, micro-enterprise, and how we can ring-fence those particular areas through social protection. What is interesting about this strategy is that there are four cross-cutting themes. There is gender, climate change, because for us, we see climate change within the context of climate information and services and how that is used to inform a lot of the pillars of the CDM strategy: information, communication, technology, and environmental sustainability. And this just gives you a sort of exploded view of each of the pillars, but shows you how several of the priority areas are used to deliver on the results of strengthened institutional arrangements. So under strengthened institutional arrangements, we're also talking about policies, normatives, and when you look at community-based disaster management capacities strengthened for vulnerable groups, how that is taken into the policy environment. And here you can see the whole issue of social protection, shock response to social protection, embedded in 4.2, embedded in 3.1, but all of them come together to deliver on priority area 1. And it's a similar situation as we go across the various areas. One of the things that we have to recognize that is important for advancing shock response to social protection is information, data, empirics. How are we collecting information on our population on a whole and being able to represent where they are across the country? Again, contained within the whole ambit of increase and sustained knowledge and intelligence for advancing disaster risk. And this is where we would then situate social protection within the socioeconomic sectors and ensure that we are factoring all of the risk considerations in the design of the sector policies, strategies, and programs. So from where we sit, SRPSRE promotes, as I said, a very integrated approach, and you will see what we look for in terms of a country that is disaster and climate resilient. What are the things, the future desired state we're trying to achieve? We're looking at ensuring that the appropriate technical capacities are in place. We're looking at the presence of up-to-date risk profiles. We're looking at appropriate institutional arrangements that are in place to minimize or respond to the needs, and that there's broad-based awareness of the vulnerability issues. I use this slide because the discussions we've been having all morning is very much encapsulated and wrapped up into a number of these bubbles that I'm showing here in terms of looking at the issue of social protection, the budgetary support, which is critical. You know, we've been talking about ensuring that we can plan for the most vulnerable before, during, and after. But what you're seeing in the Caribbean context is a number of countries whose economic base is eroding with each event. How are we able to then deal with the wide range of social protection needs under normal circumstances, more so after an event? Is there only a dependency on the external community to finance these shock responsive social protection, as we call it? Now, how we drive the strategy and drive our operations, we have a governance architecture, so finance and economics, physical environment and planning, agriculture, education, tourism, civil society, and health sector. And this is driven at the regional level and also reflected at the national level. This is made up of key stakeholders at the regional level, informing and integrating these considerations into the policy and programming environment. So, as we look at the Caribbean today, what are we seeing? We still recognize that there is still very high vulnerability within the Caribbean, high exposure. Most of the Caribbean's economic activity takes place within 2 miles of the coastline. So 70% of our population live within the coast. So the very exposed population and very vulnerable population with very limited resource base. We have increased urbanization of our societies. Almost all the Caribbean countries are growing at a rapid rate in terms of urbanization and their aging population. So very, very high incidence of vulnerability. So from our context, when we're looking at this whole issue of risk and vulnerability, are we taking into consideration the key variables that are supposed to be informing our social protection policies in normal times, but also in emergency times? And of course, the whole issue of the impacts reversing development gains and the changing climate, increasing unpredictable nature of weather. And of course, this was front and center this September, as you would recall, for those who would have been watching from your television sets, your computers, where we had 3 Category 5 storms within the space of 2 weeks, developing just to the east of the Leeward Island, Windward Island arc, which never happened before. We've never had a Category 5 hurricane developing at that point or so rapidly in the case of Maria, which in 7 hours went from a Category 3 to a Category 5 plus storm. And it impacted and put a threat on 9 of the SEDEMA member states. So remember now, SEDEMA provides a value-added service in terms of when the event happens, we respond to a member state who may be overwhelmed. But the system was designed and built for 1 or 2 countries being impacted at a time, not 9. Right? So this really changed the game, so to speak. And the outcomes, again, were, as I've said, they're all too familiar story. Similar outcomes over and over again, where we looked at the direct impacts, infrastructure, stress on emergency preparedness and response mechanism, high operating expenses. We looked at, in the indirect area, risk to future socioeconomic development. And of course, Dominica is facing that today. A very long road ahead. If we were to think back to Grenada after Ivan, it took them 10 years for their economy to go back to the plus side of growth. Dominica is perhaps going to be much longer unless they're able to exploit emerging growth sectors within the reconstruction environment. In terms of direct costs, we're hearing about figures ranging in the 6 to 7 billion US dollars worth of losses across all the states that have been impacted over the 2 to 3 weeks. Short to medium term loss of revenue and increased expenditure to rehabilitate. We're looking at issues in terms of indirect future investment into some of the key industries that are affected by the countries. So in Dominica, 100% of their tourism product was destroyed. 100% of their agro project was destroyed. The tourism sector was built on nature tourism. That's going to take a while to come back. So threat to future investments. This is just a snapshot. You've seen, most of the images of what we've seen, and I put the slide there that, what we recognize over the last few months, if no one believed, was perhaps proof of the case that the climate is changing. If we don't want to believe anything else, we know that warm water gives fuel to these cyclones, and it's hotter this year than it was last year. So, and I've put here that if, SIDS catch a cold whenever the developed world sneezes. These are for those who don't believe that climate change is an issue. So, we're catching the cold from the developed world, and, we have to look to see how we fortify ourselves against the common cold or flu. This event really had tremendous implications for us at SEDEMA, and we worked very closely with the international community during this event. We've had a long relationship now with WFP, which was strengthened over the last couple of years, and with UNICEF. We're working also with OCHA, primarily to see how we integrate the sort of national to regional to international scaling up of disaster response. And this was on demonstration over the course of this particular response, recognizing that we had to respond to 9 countries, while SEDEMA deployed over 350 operatives in the field over the first 2 weeks of the event. Clearly, from a resource standpoint, it was beyond the scope and capability of the agency. And so we had to lean on our international partners working in concert with us. But that was also part of the plan. We're looking at interoperability and how we build the regional infrastructure and architecture on common standards that facilitate interoperability. One of the biggest challenges we faced was the issue of predictable financing for the regional response operations. So we have what we call an emergency assistance fund, which is financed by our 18 member governments. But as you can see, with the challenging economic climate, that inflow isn't as consistent as it needs to be. And so it impacts on your ability to be able to predict what you are able to bring to the table and to respond to the needs, and it's something that we have to look at. So what were lessons confirmed? I don't like to use the term lessons learned. It's not learned until when we actually implement what we found out in practice. I call them confirmed. That we need to look at enhancing the response capacity for multiple catastrophic events. We need to recognize that vulnerabilities provide, that we have vulnerabilities and we have to provide measures to treat them. We're talking a bit about some of those things in terms of social protection and shock responsive social protection. Need for us to enhance our understanding of the spatial representation of risk and vulnerability, and to look at building standards, building codes. Why did I say that? In all the countries that were affected, even where there were 90% damage, or 80% damage, or 75% damage, there was evidence that the buildings could withstand Category 5 if they're built according to appropriate design, code, and if these are enforced. Even the modest housing. There are a number of wooden, very low-income houses that stood up to this event. But we need to find out why that is and replicate that, so we can build back better. So SEDEMA operates a very important architecture called the Regional Response Mechanism. The way it is built, we train across all 18 member states, and our response architecture is drawn from all member countries. So we have specialized teams for search and rescue, for rapid needs assessment, for operational support for the member countries who need help within their EOCs, for broader damage assessment coordination, for health teams, all trained, built within the member states, and is harnessed from among the members and led by the SEDEMA coordinating unit. It is done under several principles: sovereignty, so we respect the sovereignty of our member countries; solidarity, it is driven by the mandate of SEDEMA; it is very much in keeping with humanitarian principles, and also forged on the basis of partnerships. The key concepts: we promote all hazards, disaster risk reduction, and interagency coordination. And it is also cognizant of the regional realities, one which is logistics, access and transport, which is a very big challenge for us in the region. And those who work with us from WFP would know that moving within the region is a significant challenge. So we were able to get into all of these countries within the first 6 hours, but we had to use every single means of getting there. And even when we got into Dominica, the operational environment was such that it required airlift and rotary wing airlift. And these aren't available in large measure within the Caribbean that can fly relief into some of these communities that were affected. So it was a real challenge, and we had to depend heavily on our external military partners, the French, the Dutch, the British, and the Canadians and the Americans, to give us a lift. Now, what this is trying to show is some work we're doing now in terms of revising the regional response mechanism. And one of the things we recognize is that there are certain countries, for example, given the capacity within the Caribbean, a country like Dominica should not trigger an international scale response. Dominica has about 70,000 people. Within the Caribbean, we would have been able to identify all of those capacities and skill sets that should be able to respond to those needs. And so what we've been doing here is trying to determine which countries really should be generating what we would call an international scale event. And we see only Jamaica, Haiti, and Trinidad potentially having that capability of having events that would require an international scale operation, simply because of the size of the population, the size of the country. But unfortunately, we're still in a space where events in Barbuda, in Dominica, is still requiring international level responses. And I think that's something that collectively as partners we have to learn from, and we have to look to see how collectively we build regional capacity and national capacity to be able to do that. And so this is one of the mechanisms we've been practicing to facilitate greater coordination among the member states, all the actors regionally and actors internationally, to try and effectively coordinate when we go into this sort of national to regional to international operational theater. So as we look at all of what we saw over September, and as we discuss this whole issue of shock responsive social protection, one of the things we have to reflect on is the agenda for humanity, which talks about leaving no one behind, and a number of other issues around strengthening the way we deal with persons who are affected, but also integrate them and put them at the center of responding to these issues. And I think what we're trying to do here in terms of advancing shock responsive social protection is very much contributing to a lot of the intent of the agenda for humanity. But even as we look at that from the Caribbean context, I think there are certainly some challenges we have to look at as we look at this new normal in being able to live up to the aspirations of the agenda for humanity, and certain barriers which we have to try to get beyond. So one of our lack of explicit role for regional organizations in this space, that was a major discussion in the consultations going up, the role of regional organizations and how do we get them to be more recognized within the broader international humanitarian policy environment. The status quo, whether they are adept to transferring responsibilities to new actors coming into this space, is something we have to confront and discuss. We've been fortunate. We've been at the early stage negotiating and dialoguing with our partners around this process. The lack of consistent financing and the need for international donors to better support leadership and reinforce capabilities of regional organizations in their efforts to support these activities. Just some views on this whole issue of shock responsive social protection. What we've seen in the Caribbean context, the typical practice is for there to be more rental subsidies, grocery subsidies, seeds for planting and equipment and fishing equipment dealt with post-impact. But in some countries, like Jamaica, you have a program, and several of the colleagues are here who can speak to that, where they provide, as part of their broader national programming, an integrated approach to dealing with shocks within the context of their social protection mechanism, led by the Ministry of Social Security. Was it? Labor and Social Security. I've been away so long I can't remember the name of the organization. And it is done primarily through their PATH program that they have there. But one of the things we recognize as we go event over event is that the poor are the most affected. You've seen this in literature. It is true. Even if you have 75 to 80% of the country affected, the poor are the ones who struggle to recover from these events, to get back in their homes. When we're looking at Dominica, we have a huge population that I don't know when they're going to get back into their homes, while you have those who are in the middle and upper income levels who can begin to repair and replace homes. That not all the vulnerable persons are identified and supported. And I think that is borne out in the study that was presented, that you had that ring B, that circle B, where it talked about those who are registered and those who are not registered in that circle. Simply because in the Caribbean, again, we've not done a very good job of getting a full understanding of the suite of vulnerabilities and capturing those individuals and registering in those individuals and ensuring that we have a wide range of mechanisms to protect them in the region. We have to look at the priority for social protection measures. We have to look to ensure that this is a priority for social protection measures in normal times, that we factor this into our planning, and that there are special considerations provided for these individuals before, during, and after. So not just after, that we're dealing with their needs, their specific needs, before the impact, during the impact, and after. And there's work to be done there. That it should be designed to consider the special consideration of vulnerable populations in disaster events. So I'm saying that in normal times, in day-to-day programs, we have to bear these things in mind when we design our policies. And this is very much central in the view promoted by the CDM strategies from the sectoral approach. Countries must appreciate the challenges facing them in terms of insurance. Oh, before I go there, one of the things I want to say on the perspectives here is that there are still gaps in terms of dealing with the elderly, the disabled. It is not yet an integrated approach in all member countries, and that there is a consistent monitoring and evaluation that also needs to take place to be able to inform the strategy. One of my greatest concerns before I get to the issue of insurance is the high debt regimes facing CARICOM countries. So we're talking about social protection and shock response to social protection. We're talking about that group B and being able to broaden the focus to be able to support them. But one of the glooming concerns we have is the issue of the high debt and how that impacts on the space that government has to effectively deal with social policy and social programs. The frequent disasters, which are making budgeting for social protection very, very difficult, and for programs in normal times, let alone during disasters. These are things we have to look at. So we turn to the emerging issue of insurance and what role can insurance play in addressing this whole issue of planning for and financing social protection mechanisms post-disasters. But one of the things we have to do as countries, we have to be sure that we appreciate the challenge that is facing us first. A lot of debate has been going on about insurance, whether it is good or bad, and my good friend from the CRIF is here, reflections on the pooled insurance mechanism. Insurance is a good thing. You're selling a product, a service that is required. But as countries, we must understand what it is that we need, what we can afford, and how we then go about purchasing the requisite policy. And based on what we can afford, we have to look at what are the other strategies that we have to put in place to be able to deal with that problem. And that is something that we haven't seen yet happen. And we have to match that, certainly, with our affordability. One of the things that I'm proposing, the CRIF gives a very wide, open stance on what countries can use their insurance payout to do. I think one of the areas that should be looked at is this whole area of dealing with the needs of the most vulnerable post-impact with these insurance payouts. You can literally plan on that if you trigger the policy for that type of event, and then be able to move into action very quickly to plan your various support mechanism. So shoring up social protection mechanisms post-disaster, for example, Jamaica and their PATH programs. And as I said before, we have people in the audience that can tell you a little bit about what that is. So I don't know if, I know that there is Roy here from SRPSRE, which has a similar mechanism to SEDEMA, but I'm not sure how many people in the audience are familiar with this kind of mechanism in the Caribbean, but it's been very successful, hampered by resources, of course, but I think it is certainly something we can build on in the future. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't go over my time too much.
Okay, as there wasn't so much debate, time for debate before, maybe if anyone has a question for Mr. Ronald Jackson or comment on this very, very interesting and relevant presentation, as we had announced before, there is a possibility. Also on the insurance aspects that are quite innovative and interesting, we will have some more information tomorrow from the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance. No one has a burning question they want to speak maybe later? No? No delegation? En español también, si quieren. Una pregunta? No, está bien.
No.
No. They're shy.
That's a good thing or a bad thing. Or you fell asleep after lunch. Which is it? Huh? No? I want to say here, though, before I go, that even what CRIF is promoting on MCI in terms of the microinsurance, which Liz will probably talk about tomorrow, is very much supported within the context of the CDM strategy on Pillar 4, where it talks about, where is it? Community livelihood safeguarded and strengthened through effective risk management. Within that context, we're actually promoting the whole issue of what's it called, Liz? The livelihood protection policies, which are very much supportive of that particular area within the strategy. So, yes.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one question?
Thanks. That was very interesting and gives a lot of background. And maybe picked up tomorrow when digging deeper into the insurance aspects. But I suppose the question is in two parts. First of all, obviously the sort of mechanism or, you know, the agency like that is very useful. You mentioned it's owned by the countries, basically, the member states. Presumably they have like a membership fee they all have to pay. So I'd just like to, you know, if as long as it's not politically sensitive, just, you know, do members all pay their fees and does that work would be one. And then secondly, on the insurance side, I think whilst I agree and clearly insurance is a useful thing, what are you looking at? Are you looking at like a real commercial type insurance or more like a captive fund where it was much more like self-insurance, so there would be more control on what the payouts were used for, and, you know, insurance companies basically are in it to make a profit. If you've got something like a captive fund or self-insurance, that profit can actually be plowed back in to the preventive measures that you're talking about. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more on that.
Those are two very, very important questions. And no, I'm not shy about talking about the effectiveness of member states. I speak openly in the media back home. So it's, we currently have between, in the best of times, 80% to 82% collection rate on the contributions paid by member states. So we have to practice very prudent management of resources. And again, that is directly, in some degrees, that's linked to the economic fortunes of some of our member states. So when you look at a country like Suriname, and what would have been their core economic driver being lost, which is bauxite, where the main bauxite company pulled out, and you're looking at, you know, down the chain, the impact that that has on the country. Obviously, they are having challenges, and so we're negotiating different ways of covering your obligation, you know, looking at things now like secondment of technical staff. Because the core, how SEDIMA is financed is that the core cost of running the agency is paid by member states. But the programs, SEDIMA goes out and fundraises. So we have what we call a country-centered programming approach, where we do what we call a CDM audit to all our 18 states. We look at the priorities that are emerging from this audit, and we frame our corporate plan, our 3-year corporate plan around these priorities, and then we go to the donor community, and we mobilize funds, some of which are given back to the countries in the form of grant resources. So we have what is called a country direct grant, where they access. Others are programs implemented directly by SEDIMA. So these are the two pillars. Now, to go to your other question around insurance, we all agree insurance is important, but it's one tool in a toolkit of tools. It is one way of also covering your risks. And so we do promote the sort of national level funds. In our case, we call them the National Disaster Funds. Some people call them the Contingency Fund. We promote that as a means of self-insuring, and we talk about what percentage of the national budget should go into that. Unfortunately, again, governments have not themselves. So you talk about control. They have control over the CRIF payouts. CRIF does not say to them, you have to use it for this or for that. It's yours. You get it. And invariably what happens is that it goes into the government consolidated fund. And so they do exercise control. The question is, what does it finance? No one knows. You know? They will tell you, but you don't know because it goes in the consol fund. But Liz, I'll let you speak to it. But the point I want to make here is that they have control over those funds, as they do have control over the National Disaster Fund, which would then be able to do some of the other things that you need to do. But also, more importantly, and this is where, in my point, I had to rush through a little bit, where I talked about declining budget space. When you don't have an event that triggers the CRIF, how do you finance those response and recovery costs? How do you finance the extra amount you need to put into your budget to deal with the shock component of the shock response to social protection? And so the Caribbean is in a very challenging place as we speak today, given the exposure to climate risk, declining budget space, high debt profiles. And so we have to really think very carefully as to how we're going to be dealing with this issue of social protection, how we're going to finance it, and why it is important that we look at other ways of covering risk. And CRIF is very much supportive of that. I don't want to speak to, because Liz is going to speak tomorrow, but CRIF, in the first cover, they say to countries, first page, this is not the fund of, this is a fund of last resort. So what other measures are you putting in place as governments to be able to transfer risk, but also cover risk, what you can reduce? And that's something that SDIMA also promotes through the strategy. So Pillar 1 talks about a number of other financial instruments that we should really be looking at to finance risk management, and not just one tool in one toolkit of dealing with risk, disaster risk financing.
Thank you. Thank you. Big applause.
Liz wanted to make a comment about the...
could we take it up again tomorrow in your session?
Yeah, all right.
No, I would pick up those how payouts, but I mean, I guess if it's fresh in everybody's minds, what we have recognized is that whilst initially we recognize countries as, you know, being democratic and so on, and governments being able to utilize their payouts in whatever way they could, we never stipulated reports on how payouts were used. Granted, over the years, we have gotten reports, you know, it was done, we rehabilitated roads, etc. In the case of Haiti, we heard 1.4 million people were benefited from 50% of Matthew's payouts, but we are heavily capitalized by donors, and also through bilateral arrangements. And what that means is that at the end of the spectrum, it's really many taxpayers who capitalize and allow us to be able to provide insurance, parametric insurance that is affordable. So to this end, what we are currently working on is some simple checklists that countries would have to, you know, be asked to fill out as part of their policy arrangements, so that we could know for exactly where resources were spent, what the impacts of those, the payouts were, etc. So, I mean, based on continuous improvement, we continuously look and see how best we can help countries better utilize resources.
Thank you for the clarification. I think it was very helpful. And again, get your questions ready for tomorrow. Thank you. Thanks again to Mr. Jackson. Thanks. A big applause. I think this, bueno, we have to switch again to Spanish for the next panel. Vamos a pasar